Hi everybody and welcome to webinar 43. Tonight we'll be talking about report writing and recording, and we have a very special panel of special guests for you. While you're all coming into the room, we've got 60 of you so far. What I want to ask you is, where in the world are you? Are you a social worker? Are you a student? Are you a practice educator? What field of work are you in? And because tonight is talking about recording and report writing, I want to know, when was the last time you wrote a letter to somebody? So emails don't count for this kind of question. When's the last time you wrote a letter to somebody? So tell us what kind of letter you wrote. We don't need like all the details, but if you've written a letter recently, what did you write and when was the last time you wrote a letter? So we are on webinar 43. We have 150 people here. So tell us where in the world you are. Are you a student, social worker? Are you a practice educator? And when was the last time you wrote a letter? It is 3 minutes past and the numbers seem to have slowed down, so I'm going to hand over to Siobhan and I'm going to read the rest of your comments in the chat. So brilliant, thanks everyone.
So as Kelly said, welcome to our 43rd webinar. We are tonight looking at recording and report writing, and we're actually going to follow a similar kind of format to the format that we had for our essay writing webinar, because that was so popular, with different people giving you different tips about what worked for them. So tonight we've got lots of people with lots of different tips about assignment writing, and there are all different stages, I suppose, of their own social work career and journey and their own experiences of writing records and reports. And so everybody's going to be sharing different kinds of tips tonight that will all come together, and we'll bring them all together at the end. So just checking the slides aren't moving. There we go. So we're going to be looking at doing the right thing in your recording. And I suppose it's a bit of a play on words, as in write or writing your recording. Most people are now typing recording, I suppose, instead of handwriting them, but it's all that about how do we write our records. And our fabulous panel of guests, I'm not going to introduce each of them at this moment because they will introduce themselves as the session goes along, but it's going to be a very packed session, and I think probably one that you're going to want to watch back on YouTube actually and just pick up again, because there's so many really fabulous points to be made tonight. So I'm not going to mess around. I am just going to hand straight over to our first guest. Farrah, if you're there and can switch your microphone on, then we're going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. I am. Hi everyone, it's an absolute pleasure to be here and an honour. So my name's Farrah Khan. I'm joining you from Leeds, and it's really nice to see lots and lots of people from Yorkshire joining us. So yeah, let's keep it going in the north. I'm Principal Social Worker for Children and Families in Leeds, and also Head of Service. And I suppose, have worked in Leeds most of my career, but also in a partnering authority for a while in children and families and the voluntary sector. And what I want to do today is just share with you a few tips that I've developed along the way in relation to recording and report writing, but also based on now being more on decision-making panels, that what the expectations are and what people are looking for when you do go to different meetings or reviews, etc. So I thought the meetings we could look at is maybe child protection case conferences, looked after reviews, legal gateway meetings, people call them different things in different authorities. Might be a fostering panel report, an adoption panel report, and also the dreaded court report. And just years ago, when I trained to be a social worker many moons ago, something stuck with me. I went on a training course delivered by Bernardo's by young people who were looked after. And one of the young people said, imagine that I'm stood behind you, looking over your shoulder. Imagine that I'm doing that while you're writing about me. And that's something that's always stayed with me. So I think that's really important. Can we go to the next slide, please? I also am going to share something personal with you. So I'm quite severely dyslexic. And that means that I have developed a range of weird ways that work for me. So if this, just take bits from this that might work from you, but these are tips that I've developed that actually worked for me and helps me organise and process information that can then make sense for reports. And I hope you can all hear me because the micro wasn't working too well earlier and my chat isn't working now. So I look at things in a way that actually stick. I'm quite a visual learner. And so I came up with this concept of purpose, point, prediction, plan. And I thought that's all the P's, and it's actually quite easy to remember. So if I think of 4 P's in relation to report writing, I thought that's quite an easy concept to remember. So it's not rocket science, as social work isn't, and I'm not an academic, but I just devised things and took the best bits of other people's work and thought about what would work for me. And I suppose whatever format you're writing in, whatever meeting you're writing for, it's really important to think about the purpose and take a little bit of time to think about the purpose of your report, because I think if you're clear on the purpose, that will help you, that will guide you through the report, but also make sure that you stick to what the aim of the report is. And the purpose, the definition of a purpose is really why we're doing something. You know, what's our aim and intention? What are we trying to do? So if you think about a looked after childcare review where children are in local authority care, what you want to do when you're writing a report for that is you want to give an update on where the child's at, and you want to provide a really thorough understanding of the child's needs and circumstances for that meeting. And so if you focus on that, then you will have that in mind when you're going in to write your report. So I always spend a bit of time thinking about purpose and also reading a lot of reports. It's very, very clear people who have spent time thinking about purpose, because we know that they're not copy and pasting from different reports, and they're not copy and pasting from, for example, an assessment that's kind of been done 6 months ago to a review that's happening now. So they're thinking about the now. And I know it's so tempting when you're busy to think that copying and pasting in this is the solution, and it's absolutely not, because what you can do is be informed by what's happened before. But firstly, if it was about me, I'd be quite insulted that people haven't taken the time to update what they're writing. But secondly, it actually comes across to the reader as not professional, as sloppy, and it's quite, you know, and actually not up to date, not being truly reflective and providing a real picture of what's going on. So think about your purpose, think about why you're writing that report and what your aim is. If you go into a decision-making panel, then you want to make sure that you're clear on what the decision is that you're seeking, and also that you've thought about all the possible outcomes. So the next slide, thank you, Siobhan. You're better than Professor Chris Whitty's person. Point. And in this kind of in report writing in relation to this subject matter, staying to the point, which is really hard for me, I'm conscious of time, is about you know, sticking to the topic, keep to the topic without drifting to other topics. And this is really easy done, because in social work, and I'm finding it a challenge right now, we tend to drift. And our mind tends to drift here, there and everywhere. And your practice educators will do it, and you'll pick that up. If you are a practice educator, be mindful that you're teaching students good habits. So what I mean by that is, you know, it's okay to talk about what's happening now and maybe a little bit of history to inform, to understand patterns of behaviour. But if you go into somebody's history unnecessarily and actually think to yourself, is this necessary? Is this adding anything to the report? What is the person reading going to gain from this? How is it going to make a difference to the person I'm writing about, to their lives? Then that's really important. So by that, I mean, sometimes report can be really overly critical because we hang on to history in a negative way and don't allow people to move on. So stick to the point. You know, it is not a young person's fault if they've had a care history, but what we do is often when we write about them now, we don't let go of the care history. You know, we write about them now as if they have to carry that burden, and we don't look from a strengths-based approach. So that's what I mean about point. Think about your point. Next slide, please. And I thought, prediction, what is prediction actually? And it's, you know, a lot of people think about prediction as, you know, analytical prediction and kind of computer and machine learning. But actually, as human beings, we predict all the time. So today I was going out, looked a bit cloudy. I took my umbrella with me. There was a chance of rain. So I think it's really important that you think of, from the information you have, what are you predicting? What's that information telling you? What do you think will happen based on that information? And again, it's not rocket science. You're gathering information, what's relevant to the point, and then you're thinking about how that affects the child and family. And predictions based on evidence are okay, because that's what we do in social work, all the time. Predictions based on biases or discrimination, or what we think, you know, is right or not okay. So make sure that your predictions are based on the information you've gathered and that they're backed up by evidence, and use research appropriately as well. But a caution with research, you could find research to back up anything you believe in. And so if you come with a bias, you will find research to back up your bias. So I say to people, unless you're going to use research the right way, you know, don't go there. It's important that we think about research, because research helps us develop and grow and understand and learn. However, you know, you have to make sure you're not using it to back up your biases and just to prove a point, because we can easily do that and try that theory out. Sometimes it's so easy to do. Can we get the next slide, please, Siobhan? And finally, you know, all your kind of your purpose, your point, your prediction, they're pointless unless you're going to formulate a plan out of them. And so, you know, we've got to make sure that all that information we gather and what we predict, we're actually using it to inform what support a family needs. So a plan is really a proposal for doing or achieving something. So, you know, if I go to Slimming World and they tell me that I need to lose so many stone and I go on the scale, they help me devise a plan as a result of that. If I just went there and they told me off for it and made me feel really useless and not achieving anything, there would be no point for me to go. So think about that. When you're doing your reports, there has to be a plan. Reports are not just about gathering evidence, and they're not just there to capture in history, you know, information about a family. They have to formulate a plan, because otherwise there's no point of doing them. And I think the best plans come from reports that are actually quite clear, that are strength-based, that are positive, but that another P that I forgot to add in here, that are about the person. So think about what you would want written about you. Don't write anything about anybody else that you wouldn't want to see about you. And people often think that they can't write positively where there are concerns. And of course you can. There's always a different way to write something. I think I kept that in time.
You absolutely did, Farrah. Thank you so much. And although you had 4 Ps, as you were talking, there were so many other Ps, weren't there? Like you were talking there about the person and being positive, and you could have done 20 Ps really. But what I love was that idea of 4 Ps. And although your slides say child-friendly leads, and obviously you were talking at the beginning about decision-making forums around children, those 4 Ps could be applied anywhere in any area of social work. And that's what I really liked about what you've just shared there. And I think it was a great start to the evening. So thank you very much for that, Farrah. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions for you in the queue. Well, I can see questions popping up already. So I think you'll be busy in the chat now for the rest of the evening, Farrah. Thank you. And now we're going to hand over to Mary. So although Farrah started us off thinking about children's services, tonight we've been joined by people from across the whole spectrum of social work. So I'm hoping Mary's now spotlighted. So Mary, if you put your mic on, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Yeah, so I'm Mary Buckman, mental health social worker by background and still a practicing approved mental health professional. I am the Associate Director of Social Care for Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust, which is a mental health and community health provider across a number of different counties. And I'm also the co-chair of the Basware England Mental Health Special Interest Group. So what I want to say first is thank you to Siobhan for inviting me this evening, and it's really nice to be speaking to all of you. How many hundreds of you there are out there in the ether. What you'll also notice today is there's going to be some golden threads that run through probably all of the speakers. There'll be some common themes that we're using, and there'll be a reason for that. So pay particular attention if you're finding that we're saying the same things, even in slightly different ways. So I want to talk about social work report writing, and as Siobhan's just said, whilst I'll be talking particularly from a mental health and adult social care perspective, these suggestions and hints are relevant across the board. So I want to start with thinking about who your audience is. What is this thing you're writing? Who is it for? Who's going to be reading it? We don't write these things just to sit in files on computers. We write reports for a reason. Someone needs it. We need to be very mindful of then our power when we're writing reports. We have access to a huge amount of information about people. We know much more about them than they know about us. We're writing that down for other people to see it. So, as you've heard Farrah say earlier, I would also be saying that write your report, always write your reports as if the subject of them will be reading them. Because whilst that might not be true immediately, for whatever reason, the context might not enable that to happen, they may well access their records at some point in the future. And what you don't want to happen is you've written a report as if the person you're writing about is not going to read it, and you're saying things in a way that might be difficult for them to read, but also might be quite harmful to them if they're reading something, particularly if they don't agree with it or you've got some facts wrong. So if we're thinking about the service user, the family, reading the report we're writing, we'll be extra careful to make sure that what we're writing is accurate. How are you referring to them? What language are you using? Firstly, be consistent, but also be respectful. Don't automatically use the person's first name. If possible, if you've been able to involve them in the writing of the report, for example, if you're writing a mental health tribunal report or a report for the Court of Protection, have you been able to involve them in that process? Have you talked to them about this report that you're writing? What language do you want them to use? Do they want you to use? So ask them if possible, and only use their first name if that's what they want. I would suggest the default is always to use Mr., Ms., but ask them what prefix they would prefer. And the voice of the person. You're there representing them. You're telling a story. You're using your professional judgment, but you're telling a story. And make sure that the voice of the person is coming through. So reports that I receive that I think are really good are reports that I can read having no previous knowledge of that person, and I leave that report thinking I know a little bit about them. I know what they're like as a person. I know what's important to them. I can feel their voice coming through this report. So in terms of the structure, what story are you telling? You know, if you're writing an essay, you start with formulating an argument. So what is that argument and how are you going to structure it? So some reports, thinking of it like an essay, can be quite useful. Some reports come with a pre-existing structure. Social circumstances reports for tribunals often have a standard template that is quite useful. But what is it you're saying? So don't just bring a lot of facts together without thinking about what it is you're trying to evidence. And they're going to be decisions made, often by other people, based on what you've put in that report. So be very mindful of what facts you are using or information that you've obtained that you're presenting as facts. I'm going to give you an example from my practice from many years ago when I read a report saying that someone had Asperger's, and as a result of having Asperger's they weren't eligible for learning disability services, and it excluded them. Rightly or wrongly, these days diagnoses either entitle you to services or sometimes exclude you from services. And it took a lot of unpicking to say, well, where has this come from? Where has this diagnosis come from? I can't see anything else in his records, but there was one reference to a consultant who'd seen him once in passing many years ago and thought he might have Asperger's. And in every other report, it was written as fact. It was written as he has Asperger's, and actually he didn't. And because of that, he'd been excluded from the appropriate support services for him. So if you are including things like diagnosis or including information about risk behaviours or vulnerabilities that they might have, make sure that that information is accurate. You know, you can always ask them and members of their family as well. Sometimes some of the complaints we receive after people have accessed records is that there's something written here that's not true and I don't know where it's come from. So always make sure you know. And I saw in the chat earlier references to cutting and pasting. It's always evident when that's happened. So make sure when you're writing a report that you are writing something fresh. If you are lifting and shifting from someone else's report or a report that's written for a different purpose, it will be quite clear, but also you don't necessarily know where the author of that piece of work got their information from. And if you haven't written a report before, ask what good looks like. So if you have no idea what a tribunal report looks like, a social circumstances report or a report for the Court of Protection, ask if one has been done by one of your colleagues. Speak to your supervisors, speak to your team managers about, is there a good version that I can read so I get an idea of how to structure and how to present this information. We don't always know. We've all been there for the first time, staring at the blank screen, not knowing where to start. Always a good idea to see if you can say, is there a good version of the report that I can see? And make sure that the information you're putting in the report is relevant. We have, as part of our professional role, access to huge amounts of information about people, and be clear who your audience is, as we've talked about before, and make sure that the information you're putting in that report is relevant to the argument that you're making. Don't just put all the information you have into the report if it's not relevant, because it's not your information. So what have you assessed? If this is an assessment report and you are giving your professional opinion, don't be afraid to talk about your professional judgment. There's a reason that you're writing the report. It's because you're a social worker with expertise. You've made an assessment. You are giving them your professional judgment and often making recommendations, whether that's to a tribunal, to a court, or to some kind of resource panel. So make sure that you're being clear, and don't be afraid to say, it is my judgment that. You've presented the evidence to support that. Don't just come out with your judgment from nowhere. Present all the evidence and don't be afraid to say it's your professional judgment. Remember your social work values and demonstrate them in what you're writing. Don't make value judgments. In adult social care, we're often going into people's homes. We might be seeing circumstances that are quite challenging. They might be struggling to care for themselves. There might be examples of self-neglect. Be really careful how you describe that. Think about rights-based approaches as well. You know, what if you're structuring your argument to achieve something, whether it's to access resources or whether it's for a tribunal or a panel to make a decision about someone maybe leaving hospital or no longer being detained under the Mental Health Act. Think about the rights of the person and how you are supporting those rights to be enabled. Avoid jargon. We hate jargon. We all use it. We all do every day, but don't put it in a report, particularly acronyms. Even things like CMHT, for example, we might use it every day. AMHP, CPN, CMHT, we use them all the time. If you're going to use them in a report, at least the first time you use it, spell out what that acronym actually stands for. Remember that you're the expert. There's a reason you've been asked for the report, and that's because you've made an assessment. So you are the expert. And if, for example, it's a tribunal where you write a report and then you're expected to present that report and answer questions on it, remember, it's your report. So you should be happy to stand by the information you've put in it and the recommendations you've made. And then read before sending it. Grammar and spelling. Spell checks are wonderful, but they don't correct things that are real words. So sometimes you can end up with the wrong words being used in the wrong context because it's not picked it up in spell check. And sometimes the grammar suggestions that come through don't particularly make sense. So try and structure. I don't find that easy. Grammar is terrible. I find it really hard to structure things, and I have to read it again and again. But sentence construction, where you put a comma, can really change the meaning of a sentence. So be really clear about what it is you're trying to say and how you've structured your paragraphs to make that argument. Read it before sending it. As I say, I often read reports that are written by other people, and it's a real heart sink moment, because you read a lot of reports, we're all rushed, you read a report and you think, I'm not sure what this is saying, I'm not sure about this, or the grammar's really wrong, or there's lots of spelling mistakes, and I can't, if I'm being asked to approve it, I can't send it where it needs to go. There's work that needs to be done on it. I'll only end up sending it back to you, which is always a bit of a heart sink when I have to structure an email saying, thanks for it, thanks for this report, I know you've put a lot of work into it, but can you pay some attention to? And the last thing you want is kind of a report that comes back to you with loads of track changes all over it, which it's a heart sink to do it, it's a heart sink to receive it. And we've all been there. You know, the clock's ticking, we've got 100 million things to do, we've got this report to get done, we get it done, we put the last full stop in and we ping it off. Take 10 minutes just to take a deep breath, step away, make yourself a drink, come back and read it fresh. Read it through, because that's when you'll spot the difference, any issues with it. And the last point for me, if you're really not clear, ask for help, ask for assistance, ask for someone else to read it. If at all you're unclear, we'd much rather do that than it come back to you further down the line. And that's it for me. Hope that was helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Mary, sharing your advice there. I'm going to go straight over now to hand on to Richard. If you can put your mic on and introduce yourself, Richard.
Hi, everybody. My name's Rich Devine. I'm a social worker for Bath and North East Somerset Council. I qualified in 2010. I spent several years working in a long-term child protection team, and I've spent the last 3-4 years doing parenting assessments. So I've had extensive experience of writing assessments. I just want to say it's really exciting to be here. I've watched so many of these webinars, and finally to get a chance to meet the Student Connect team and obviously to meet Siobhan. She's when you've been in social work as long as I have, she's like a national social work treasure. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to make 5 key points today, and basically these are 5 key points that I've extracted out over the past 10 years. In terms of what I think, basically the 5 points derive from a blog I wrote about the why of chronologies. If you've watched any of the past webinars in the past, you would have heard Siobhan talk about how we often get taught in social work what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, but less often we're taught why to do it. And so the why of why we do chronologies and the principles that I'm going to talk about today are relevant to whether you do a single assessment or a court report or any other type of report, I think, within children and family social work. So the first thing is about understanding children's social care and involvement. I like to know every referral and what the outcome was, every assessment that's been undertaken, and the outcome, whether there's been strategy meetings or legal meetings, and if care proceedings, I would like that to be included too. It's really important, I think, to kind of understand in the present the extent of social work involvement that the family has had in the past. I want to be able to know, has this family had 2 social workers, or if they had 7 social workers? And if they've had 7 social workers, for example, I want to be able to look either through the history or the records that we have, or directly with the family, which of those 7 social workers that was the most successful in forming a kind of meaningful alliance and a relationship with, and see if there's anything that I can replicate or learn from them. The second key point is understanding patterns of behaviour. This is probably one of the most crucial parts of our role within children's social work, and part of it is because we're trying to determine whether we should be involved or whether the involvement should be statutory or not. And I don't think there's anything more crucial than that. And so when we're looking at patterns of behaviour, whether that be substance misuse, domestic abuse, mental health or neglect, we want to be looking at these three components. The duration, the severity and the frequency. In the signs of safety literature, they have quite a useful way of conceptualizing this, and it's the first, worst and last, and it's kind of a similar idea. And the reason why this is important, because the duration is what provides information on how long the individual has experienced the pattern of behaviour. Because if there's a pattern of behaviour that's been in place longer, it's more likely to be difficult to change. The severity gives us an idea of how severe the pattern is, and therefore helps us understand the impact of the intensity of support that's going to be needed. And the frequency gives us an idea about the impact upon functioning. And patterns that manifest in different contexts across time are predicted to be more resistant to change, whereas patterns that are context specific are predicted to be more malleable to change, especially if the context that facilitated the pattern changes. The third point, I forgot I'd put this bit in, is so this is a quote from Eileen Monroe in her book Effective Child Protection. The best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour, and that's a really important quote. It's not a good predictor, it's the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour. The third point is around support, and we're looking at three elements here. What support has been provided, what the pattern of engagement is, and what the impact of support is. There's really limited utility in working with a family without understanding the support that's been provided in the past, because you risk duplication, offering that which has already been provided. It's an ineffective use of resources. There's and there's repetition of the same outcomes. So, for example, if we provided parenting support and there continues to be concerns for parenting, then we must consider two things really. One, that the parenting support is unlikely to yield a different outcome if we were to provide it again. And two, that perhaps we've misunderstood the problem, that if it's perhaps it's their drug use or some unresolved trauma that's interfering with their parenting rather than parenting per se. And there's one other point I would like to make about support, is that you don't want to get too hung up on engagement with support, because some families or some parents, they can engage in every service under the sun and make no changes to the experiences that they afford the children. Whereas some parents won't engage in any of the services, but still make the changes that's required. The fourth point is looking at child's developmental experiences, especially in terms of the impact of harm. And I would tie that into patterns of behaviour that was discussed during the second slide. So what I want to be able to do as a social worker is look through the history, either on the system or with the family, and for each incident or event we want to know whether the child was present, and if so, what they heard, what they saw, and how they reacted at the time. We're really trying to get a sense of the children's lived experiences. And it's also important that we try and understand children's development across time. It may be that the behaviour of a 7-year-old makes more sense if we understand what happened when the child was 2 years old. Equally, it may be that what Farrah talked about, prediction. If we look at a child's emotional and behavioural presentation and we see that there's problems that begin, for example, from the age of 2, and we see that it increasingly gets worse when the child is 3, and then again when the child is 4, and then again when the child is 5, we can begin to make predictions about the likely trajectory of their development if if change doesn't occur, and I suppose that's the important part, if change doesn't occur, we can make predictions about the possible trajectory. And then the final, but most important point, I suppose, this is a quote by Andrew Tennell, who founded Signs of Safety. He really was a master at finding exceptions, times when the family coped well in the work that he did. And his argument is that the worse the problem, the more severe the difficulties are, the more important it becomes to find the positives, no matter how small, because it gives you an opportunity, it gives you something in which you can honour the family members with. And exceptions may also include times when, so to give you an example, I had a case where we'd been involved pretty intensively for the last 2 or 3 years, and there was substantial concerns. And when I reviewed the chronology, when I wrote the chronology, what I found was that we'd had this serious involvement for the last 2 or 3 years, then we'd had no involvement for 3 or 4 years, and then we had similar serious involvement for 2 or 3 years again. So what I was then really interested in was what was happening in the life of that parent during those years, and what could we do to try and replicate what was happening in that parent's life. So it's really important that we go out of our way, and it's a skill to be developed, looking for strengths, but it's really important that we go out of our way to exploit the family's pre-existing coping strategies and strengths in a way that gradually improves the safety of children. And that is me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rich. That was great. I really totally agree with you about finding those exceptions, those positives. And that's fascinating, isn't it? When you see in a chronology, what was going on there when we didn't need to be involved, finding that exception. So thank you very much for sharing that. And we're going to move very quickly on because we've got so much to get through tonight. And I'm going to hand over now to Ian, if that's okay. Are you there, Ian?
Yes, I'm here. Good evening, all. So my name's Ian. I'm a social worker by profession and a team manager at the moment, working with people with learning disabilities and physical disabilities. But I predominantly have a background with more complex neuro, brain injury, spinal injuries, that kind of stuff in my history. But I also have an alter ego, which is the samurai social worker on your screen. And the samurai is very relevant because it's an experience and part of my psychosis. So when I experienced psychosis myself and was on the receiving end of an assessment, it kind of changes your perspective very much about the assessment process, what's involved, how it takes place, all of those component parts. If you want to flip on, Siobhan. One of my favourite quotes, and particularly the bit about how you make somebody feel. You know, when you're sitting in the presence of somebody, you may well be distressed, experiencing something that they don't understand. You know, what you say to that person, how you view that person, what you look at them like, you know, all of those things contribute to how that is received and the information is received from you. And in order to get a good assessment, I need to be able to feel relaxed or to be able to trust you, to be able to have a rapport with you in order to give you information that you might find useful. And you know, are going to have to work quite hard in order to build a trust with me when you are the all-powerful. You want to flip on Siobhan? So these are my little rules for understanding the perspective of the assessed, and I just want you to know that these are my rules. They're not everybody's rules. But they're relatively useful rules, and I would like to hazard a guess that a lot of people who've been on the receiving end of assessments kind of have similar things. And, you know, when you've been on the receiving end of a process, I didn't understand the process when I was being assessed to go to hospital. I didn't understand the process when I was in hospital. It was really difficult for me to receive that information when I was extremely distressed and not in a good place. You have, as Mary, Farrah, Richard have all alluded to, have lots of power in this relationship. And you make the choice about whether you share that with me or not. You know, you can control that power, you can hold that power, but you're not going to get anything beneficial from me. You know, you are going to come across some kind of impenetrable wall. I'm going to feel vulnerable. You know, you're coming into my life when I don't want you to be in it. Nobody really wants you in it. You know, we're social workers. We're not winning any popularity contests. You know, so when you're entering into my life, I want you to enter into it with some compassion and empathy. And I always really thought I was empathic in my practice, and I thought I was really good at, you know, connecting with people. But it's only when you've been on the receiving end you realise your limitations. You know, empathy now with people who have experienced something similar to me is almost automatic. You've got to try really hard to connect with people. And I did a neuro-linguistic programming practitioner course. One of the main things I learned from that was, you know, 3 things about how to build productive relationships. And that was to make sure that you had an unconditional positive regard for the person you're working with. So absolute, let that person know you've got a positive intent for them. Build that rapport. And by virtue of those 2 things, it generates trust. Trust becomes automatic. And then your process just becomes a system of recording. You're going to have to listen much more than you talk. You know, I can talk very well for England, right? But I know when to shut up. And so you need to be able to shut up. Think carefully about why you're asking questions, because getting me started to talk is more important than ticking boxes in a form, right? And, you know, you can gather the information you need to tick your boxes in a form by getting me to talk. If I don't talk, you're not ticking anything, you know? So get me started and then prompt me to start. And I'll give an example of that. When I went back to work after being off for 6 months, I spoke to BASWA's social work union, and somebody on the telephone talked me to my own solutions to some of the problems I was experiencing just by prompting me with, yes, and I see. She didn't say anything else. Those were the only things she said, and all it did was just prompt me to keep talking. If you do need to get started on questions, don't forget the who, what, where, when, why, and how rule, and particularly the why, as Richard says. Things to remember and get right. I am human. Hold my hand, do whatever you need to do to validate me. Let me know that I exist. You know, when I was distressed, I didn't know I existed. I was someplace else. Get the things that are really important to me correct in the detail. And by that, I mean, in the AMP assessment that was written about me, they spelled my son's name wrong. And it tortures me today, right? So, you know, the detail of just that one thing is one thing in that assessment that causes me most pain. Try to avoid giving advice. Advice is not useful. You know, I need information so that I can choose things and pathways that are good for myself. Respect my space and time. When I had a CPN visiting me, he was answering his phone, he was taking calls, he was planning his next appointment. It made me feel worthless. Paraphrase a lot. Repeat back to me just to make sure you understand what I'm meaning and not just your interpretation of what I'm saying. It's really, really important to share assessments back to somebody that's being assessed. Just a reminder that things that are incorrect can cause me pain and loss a very long time in my mind. They're not going to last a long time in yours. They're going to waste a lot of your time and waste a lot of mine, right? But they're not going to, you know, last long in your mind. You're going to go home for your cup of tea and a slice of cake, and I'm going to be sitting there looking over this assessment for months on end and worrying about the detail. You want to flip on now? This is something, and you can read this at your leisure when you get back to the YouTube, but it's just something I posted up on Facebook to all my friends sometime after I'd been recovered. Well, I say recovered, in the process of returning to work. And it just says a lot of the things that I think are important, you know, that process, big grand gestures, You know, the plan for this, the plan for that, and the plan for everything else is fine. But you need to find the key that unlocks my door so that I can progress it myself. And if you don't do that, I'm not going anywhere. You know, so, you know, the listening ear, the very simple things, being human, they're all really important. I want to read you a little poem because I think it summarises, you know, lots of things for myself. I might not get to the end of it because it usually cracks me up, but I'll give it a go. So you think you can define me, that I'm a tick in just one box, like my being is a door that a single key unlocks. But let me tell you something, I have the universe inside. I hold an untamed ocean with a constant changing tide. I'm home to endless mountains with tips that touch the sky, flocks of grand migrating birds and deserts harsh and dry. I house the wildest rivers and a host of sweeping plains. I feel in waves of sunshine or in unrelenting rains. Don't tell me that you know me, that this right here is what you are. I'm the universe in motion because I was born from stars, all right? And I want you to remember that and feel it, right? Because I feel that, right? You know, my experience is based on being bullied in school, and then the culmination of it is the ruination of me. And now I've had to reform myself and reframe myself in order to get forward in my life. So if you want to flip to the last slide, Siobhan, in a shameless and brutally opportunistic plug, this is me and my two Twitter feeds. It started off with @Positive Simply, and I started that before I got detained. Then I got detained and added the Samurai Worker, and I blog as the Samurai Social Worker. And if you want to read more, it tells you some of my thoughts and feelings about the process, and you know, and I'm angry for quite a lot of that time. And I spent an awful lot of time without seeing my son. So I had my rights removed, and as a follow-on from that, I was threatened with, you know, child protection action. It'd be on the at-risk register. My ex-wife didn't want that, you know. So I didn't see my son for 8 months, and you know, I think what I want you to understand that's really, really significant, you know, is what you do has an extraordinarily large impact, right? And so tread carefully, yeah, you know, because you have the opportunity to inflict pain, as you can see. All right, so thanks from me.
Thank you, Ian. I'm always totally moved when you're talking, and I'll put the microphone on ready to, you know, help with that poem, as you were saying, you get choked with it, but I got more choked probably anyway, so I wouldn't have been any good. But I know last week we did a webinar on Share, and you contributed to Share. You came to the book launch and talked about your experiences, and I think you know, having also received services and being a social worker, it does give you a completely different perspective, doesn't it? And I always, you know, I'm always in awe when I hear you speak. So thank you so much. And I know you're going to come back and also speak in more detail at another webinar, but thank you very much for sharing that perspective, because I think it's really important on tonight's session. So thank you. We're going to move along quickly though, because there are still, we've got 2 guests to go and some really fascinating insights and advice into recording. But I just did want to mention that this week I've been reading a book called He Died Waiting, written by Caroline Aldridge, and Caroline is going to be joining us in June. I've put the date there at a webinar, but this was a quote from that book which really struck me, because obviously I knew we were doing recording this week, and I read this and it made me think of what Ian was going to share as well. But in the book, Caroline talks about her son Tim, and she says the files that records Tim's life in a way that misses the point of him completely. There's no recognition of his intelligence, his caring nature, his resilience, or his value to his friends and his family. And people become a tick box. And more than anything, I think we wanted to, in the centre of tonight's webinar, say that's the most important thing in recording and reporting, that people are not tick boxes, that people are people. And so I'm going to hand over now quickly to Dan. If Dan can put his mic on and introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, evening everyone. Like the other panelists, really pleased to be here tonight to be able to present to you. Yeah, I've got to now follow Ian, so cheers for that. It's a bit like following the headline gig at Glastonbury or something now, but hopefully I'll be able to share a little bit of knowledge from a Welsh perspective, because that's what I'm going to bring tonight. I've got I'm a social worker. I'm a service manager within children's services in Newport. I mainly cover child protection. I've been a social worker in England and in Wales. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some work that we've been undertaking with Welsh Government and Social Care Wales on case recordings. On to that next slide. Great. So, as I say, the aim of this presentation is just talk about the background, why we've undertaken this piece of work in Wales, and like others have explained, a reflection on what is good case recording. I share with you some tips on what to include and what supports good case recording, and then to ensure case recording is suitable for the audiences in which those recordings are then put onto systems and held. And there'll also be some tips and a template that you may want to use when you're going to begin your journey in case recordings. So, Welsh context. So, for those who know, there is different legislation in Wales than there is in England. There's a Social Services and Wellbeing Act, which came out in 2014. And the aim of that act is really to be more co-productive in the way we approach our delivery of services. One of the key elements of the act is the what matters question. So what we're looking at is trying to take a strength-based approach, and also to be co-producing the work that we do rather than done to. This is done in collaboration with. So I think that's what we certainly feel the act has enabled Welsh practice to shift towards. And it's around, you know, looking at from the discussions with practitioners, individuals and families, we recognise there was a need to focus on non-standardised outcomes for families. As I say, a lot of the services that I've been responsible for working within or delivering is very much what's available to a family rather than listening to what actually the family wants. And that's the real key shift when you're looking at the Wellbeing Act. And also need to be clear about, you know, particularly around recordings, about being reflective. What are you trying to achieve? What's the outcome? What are you trying to learn from this? And being clear, as others have said, be succinct in your record keeping is really key and important value within this. And just being mindful that this is a written account that's very personal for people, and also that this is, you know, around, you know, there should be a clear outcome and a focus to your practice. There's an easy to read link to the Act if you ever want to go and find that, which is embedded within that. So it just tells you a little bit more about what the principles are, Social Services and Wellbeing Act. So the starting point for our journey was that we recognised where, and I'm sure others and yourselves as students, that case recordings, it doesn't really feature very much in the academic pathway that when you're learning to be social workers, particularly when we have students who come and do their placements with us. Case recording isn't something that's taught. It's very much something that's learned from really reading the records that are on there, and for you then to gauge and talk to someone who's supporting you about, well, what do you actually include in a case recording? What's important to put in there, and why am I writing it? Lots of people will write, you know, endless amounts, and other people will write 1 or 2 sentences. So it is, you really get a varied picture. And I think, you know, not having a structure across the systems for case recording is very different to some assessments where you often have a template or a tool that you'll be introduced to very early on, and feel quite comfortable around having that tool is an aid memoir for you to actually then know what you're almost trying to gather when you're going out to speak to someone. But within the experience of going out to visit a family, you know, there's one thing which, you know, I'll just give you tips as we go through really. But for me, you know, I remember going to sit with a family and having my notepad there and starting writing, you know, as I was talking to them, and focusing on things that I was trying to make sure I'd got written down in that meeting. And as Ian was saying, it wasn't really what the family were wanting or the parent was wanting. It was more so I was thinking about what I needed to record, what was important I had to make sure I'd written so I could go back to the office and write it up. And I think if you think of that experience, you know, it's very much, you know, very much, you know, that, you know, how would that feel if you were sat there with your head down and you were scribbling away and I was receiving that? I think it's a really off-putting experience, and you're not enabling, which is the key formation within that experience, is trying to build sort of a relationship with someone, trying to break down the reasons and understandings of why you're there. So that was sort of certainly from our perspective in Newport, one of the key reasons why we wanted to do that. And Social Care Wales had looked at that experience from many people's feedback on what it was like to go back and read their records. And so therefore they embarked on a piece of research to look at collaborating with a number of local authorities to start a pilot on case recordings. And the journey so far for us has been that we've delivered training sessions to social workers across our child protection teams. And the plan is then to extend that across the service. And then there'll be particular people within the teams then that will be responsible for looking at the case recordings, hopefully seeing some improvements and some consistencies, and feeding that back to kind of enable, hopefully, some improved record keeping. And the next example, which I'll show you, and I'll just read through for you, is really emphasises the importance of why case recordings is so valuable. So yeah, it's there for you, but essentially it's someone's experience of being at 58, going back, deciding at a later stage in their life that they wanted to understand their records. They'd left home and got married and felt that that was the right time to go back and see what had been written about them and understand their journey from what had been written in the time that they were open to children's services as very little children. And it's just really beautiful when you read that, because you've got someone talking about they didn't know what their mother was like, but they found an affinity with actually that they were an artist themselves, and they found out that their mum loved to draw. They found out that they'd seen a picture of themselves as a baby and how astonished they were that that their own children actually looked like you know, the picture of themselves as a baby, which, you know, when you're piecing together someone's life and they're reading it for the first time, you know, if you asked your parent or carer, what was I like as a kid? You know, what did I used to like doing? Did I used to like playing in puddles? Did I used to like, you know, sandwiches, you know, peanut butter? You know, they can tell you, you can seek out family members, you can tell you that information. So for some people, that's not there. And the information that's you're recording when you're qualified as a social worker is so powerful. You know, as people have said, recognise your power in that experience, because clearly just from reading that, you can see how important that was to someone. So, so what should you consider when you're undertaking a case recording? Well, you know, the next slide will tell you that it's really important to be clear and specific what you're writing. Be as Farrah, you know, as Mary has said, you know, be jargon free. Don't use complicated professional language. Reflect the individual, their voices and their opinions. Don't just keep it as as fact. Actually, it's okay to include people's opinions. It's really important to include their voices. Be concise, be coherent and well structured. Make sure it's relevant, and most importantly, make sure it's an accurate account. And by that, I would say, you know, ensure that you can share what you've written in the meeting that you're having with the person. It's quite, you know, if you're sat there, before you go, just show them what you've written. This is what I've written today. What's your thoughts on that? Because you're going to write that down when you go back to the office. And if you write that back down, and then at some point, that might be cut and pasted into a court document, that might be in your assessment, and it might not be what you've agreed in that meeting or what they've understood within that meeting. Show you're working out, ultimately. That's what you're saying there. You know, be analytical. Think about why you're writing that, so people know what you're saying, why you're recording it. It's so important. And distinguish between fact and opinion. When I say you can write opinion, that's absolutely fine, but be factual as well. You can say, I believe this is likely to happen, because as Richard was saying, you know, the past is a great indicator of the future. So you can say, well, if this carries on, it's not going to end very well for you. You can say that, that's your opinion, but the fact would be because these things are happening. So therefore, that's why you're explaining that. Okay. And then in the next slide, then, this is however you choose to write this is just quite an easy way of looking at, you don't have to write deficit-based case recordings all the time. You know, if you talk to Ian about his experience of being written about, you know, or any family that you're working with, they will, you know, you're often writing deficit-based stuff. As I was saying, you know, if you think of writing an account where you've had a referral from a nursery and they're saying, Mum turned up and, you know, she smelt of alcohol, the kids were in, you know, the clothes were smelly, there was a mark on his face, you know, he was upset all day. I couldn't really, that's okay, because you need to include that stuff. But you can also write within your recordings, you know, the next day you might want to say, he's had a really good day today. He really likes doing this, or, you know, being positive about someone. So yeah, there might be deficits, there might be risks, as there's written there about Alid. He can lose control, but also he can really enjoy reading. He can, you know, it's important to be balanced in what you write. You don't have to just think about trying to evidence so much harm and risk within your case recordings that you've got it over the tipping scales in order to evidence that harm is definitely there, without being able to feel confident enough to be okay about someone. So right, actually, yeah, you're doing a good job here. You know, there is good stuff within your parenting. Something's worked over the 10 years that you've had your child in your care. You don't have to just write all the negative stuff, which court and often things like that can lead you to sort of feel a pressure to do, because you need to evidence enough to seek a removal, for example. So it's really important to make sure that you do try and include those strengths. And record the why, and not just the how. So, you know, Rick was referred to a peer support group. So, you know, what was your purpose of that? And as it says there, you know, it's just a simple example, but it's so important not just to say, you know, referred them to substance misuse services. You know, do they want to be referred? Is it a co-production element to that? Have you had a conversation where they've come to a epiphany moment where they actually realise, yeah, I really do need this support. This is really important for me. So, you know, include that. It's really rich information. It's so important for people's records to balance it and be fair to someone. Okay. And again, just reiterating, really, co-production is so important. It's a powerful role that you have. Co-production enables you to build a relationship with the family, with the person, with the individual, with the child. So, you know, recognizing that power, you can come to an agreement. You can work with a client about how you want to read that, how that wants to read when you've written it. And when we share assessments, you know, you can convey and summarize the visit. You know, a top tip would be always make sure, you know, whatever you're writing is what you'd be prepared to say to someone. As others have said, you know, in other ways. I think that's really important. You know, again, top tip: make sure whatever you're going to write is whatever you'll feel comfortable saying to someone. And there's a template, as I said. You know, we're using that in Newport, so something along those lines. Once that comes out, and it just enables you just to think about when you're structuring your case note, when you've come away, you know, make sure that you're recording your case notes. You're recording the information in your book, on your phone, or dictating it, however you're doing that in your meeting, but that it's accurate then, and it's, you know, you can then go back to the office and make sure you keep on top of your case recording. It's really important not to let that drift, because, you know, a week down the line, if you've done 3 visits to someone and other families, and you've got caught up in something really busy, if you go back to what you've written and you can't make head or tail of it, then how do you know, you'll end up writing something that's not a true reflection. So the case recording template just enables you to do that. And again, once you've written what was going on, be analytical about it. So what does that mean? And also then just the actions from that. What are you going to do as a result of it is really important as well. So you're going to talk to your manager about something, or you're going to refer them to a service, or you're going to go and visit again tomorrow because you didn't really feel you got what you wanted to get, or whatever it is. But make sure you kind of try and have some actions from it as well. And I think that's about it from me. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. I hope that's useful, and there's a few tips there. And back to you, Siobhan.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. It's always really good as well to see different contexts, isn't it? And for us to recognise that legislation is different in different countries and contexts. So I think that was great. Thank you very much for sharing that, and some really practical tips there as well. So I'm going to pass straight over to Alex, because time is rolling on. And so Alex, if you're there to put your mic on, fabulous. There you are.
Hi, there we go. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I'm Alex. Obviously, brilliant guest speakers have sort of set the precedent here, so no pressure. Absolutely buzzing to be here. Siobhan, you are an absolute legend. So I'm Alex Moakes. I graduated from the University of Birmingham in 2018, so I'm not the baby out of the guest speakers in terms of experience. I'm currently based in a duty and assessment team, and have been since I qualified. So I've kind of come at it from that duty and assessment, kind of writing those initial assessments, being involved in court processes, and writing any sort of documents that the courts ask of us. So if we could move on. Hope everyone's not flagging. Thank you. So one of the main points that I pick up on, and I expect from my own assessment writing, is around the voice of the child. So we always have this, you know, this clear box that asks for that voice, but actually I think that the voice of the child should shine throughout the document. You know, we can't just sum it up in one box. We look at the common assessment framework, and actually it should be moulded and as part of that assessment. I really focus a lot on the direct work that I undertake with children to gain their voice and to make sure it's accurate, and I've done whatever I can to make sure I've got the best evidence from the child, and I've got their best views and what they think is important. So I use a lot of direct quotes where possible, and reference any direct work tools I've done. Obviously, we have the best job in the world to be able to get creative with our children and young people, making direct work that suits, you know, their age, their interests. You know, I've played Jenga before, talking about emotions. I've made superhero direct worksheets, and just really trying to get the best sort of representation of their views that we possibly can, pulling on that sort of what's important to them. Obviously, a big part of our assessments and any sort of reports that we write are our observations. So looking at how they are with parents, carers, key people. And then obviously on the other side of that is our lateral checks with key agencies. Who said it? What did they say? Are they the best person to be speaking to gain that information? Because obviously all of that contributes to the decisions, and the really important decisions that we make on a daily basis. Terminology is a massive biggie for me. So we've all got that part where we get a referral through poor home conditions. Well, that's so subjective. What does that mean? Is there poo on the floor? Is it that they just need carpet putting down? We have to be really specific about the terminology that we use. And remember, we are talking about people's lives here, and making sure that we're respectful in that terminology. And I think the biggie is, what's the impact? You know, what's the impact of even our involvement? It's all around the impact of the child. You know, some scenarios aren't great, and we look at that good enough principle, but actually, if that's great for the child, if that's, you know, okay for the child, that good enough parenting principle, then sometimes our impact is actually detrimental to the work that we're trying to do here. So, and then I looked at the kind of clarity. So being really clear, why are we here? Why are we undertaking this assessment? What legislation are we working under? You've heard lots of the previous guest speakers speaking about being clear around what are we doing here? Do we need consent? Is it informed consent? And having kind of all of those discussions about the process. What are we worried about? What could happen? But also, it's coming from a strength-based perspective, I thought I'd put it on there. But making sure that we're balanced in what we're saying, because actually it's not all doom and gloom. There might be a really good family support network, and other positives. I think social workers are really good at pulling out, why are we here? No, not why we're here, sorry, that's the point. What's happened, getting those views, looking at what's gone on, but we don't always consider the why. So, I've put some pointers in there. Is it that parents are being purposely neglectful, or are they actually just living in deprivation and haven't got the means to purchase, the right food? Or, we look at our graded care profile, which is how we sort of assess neglect. Is it that they haven't got the means to do so? Is it a failure to protect? Or actually, you look at a domestic abuse situation, is it that that parent is absolutely petrified of the offender? Sorry, I was looking at a comment then. Is it that they're absolutely petrified of their offender, that they're not in a position to safeguard because they're not safe to do so? We need to always consider that. Being avoidant, we see it, they're not engaged. Well, actually, is it that they're being just avoidant because they don't get it? Or is it that they've had a really bad experience? And actually, we need to unpick that before we can look at work moving forward. And then, as I've already talked about the strengths-based stuff, but the analysis, what does it all mean? What does it mean to that child? What is that lived experience of that child and young person? We can look at hypotheses. We may have thought something at the beginning of the assessment, but then actually, as the assessment has gone by, wow, that's not true, and it was something different. And I think the biggest for me is around, do parents understand it? So we talk about meaningful engagement. A parent can work with a DV perpetrator programme, but actually, if they don't recognise that behaviour is not acceptable, or it is harmful, then they can do any programme, but they're not going to get anything from it. And then moving on to sort of points, again, just reiterating grammar, spelling and punctuation. We're extremely privileged to be able to write about families, and actually these are really important documents, and it's important that we write them, like you say, as if people are going to read them, because they absolutely will. Correct names and spelling of names. We already heard from Ian about not writing his son's name correctly. This is really important to our families, and actually sometimes they may not understand what the issues that we have. They might not understand professionals' perspective, but they are going to notice if names aren't spelt right, or if names aren't in there that should be in there. It's super important. About including all relevant people. So a good piece of direct work is doing a genogram and finding out what their thoughts are around certain family members. Again, I speak about lateral checks, the who, from where, what role, how well do they know that child? Are they the best person to be speaking to? Avoiding jargon. Obviously, we always say ICPC. Well, actually, I know what that means, Initial Child Protection Conference, but is a parent going to know what that means? Keeping it balanced. So, it's not, like I say, it's not all doom and gloom. We need to be looking at those strengths, because there will be a strength. Even if it's a minute strength, there is always a strength. And I speak about that gut instinct. We all know about that gut instinct, but actually we need to make that evidence-based. We can't be seeking orders on a gut instinct. We have to have that evidence base. And then sort of the use of research, statistics, theories, case law. And again, just pulling on a previous point, yes, use that cautiously, because you don't want to be biased. And when you get asked to step up in the court arena saying, hold on a second, well, you put in here that research says this, but actually the counter argument is this, you're going to have to sit there on the stand and say, well, blah, 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 I didn't, if you haven't really researched and understood that research properly. But it's still, we know a statistic is that women, so many incidents happen before a woman, I'm doing this gender, but not, it's just because of the stats that, women, it takes so many incidents of domestic abuse to occur before somebody will contact professionals. We know that's what stats tell us. We know that exposure to domestic abuse as a child can have a long-lasting impact, including anxiety, sleep irritability, concerns regarding friendships and the ability to sustain friendships. We know that, so we can use things like that. But obviously, it's like how has been said before, that needs to be used appropriately, and not just to reinforce your point, but to give a broader perspective of the concerns that may be occurring at that point. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. Do you know what I loved hearing you saying we've got the best job in the world? Because actually we have. And you also talked about the privilege that we hold as social workers, and it's fabulous to see someone fairly early in your social work career, sort of 3 years in, and still really feeling that sort of real privilege. I think it's really important, and I suppose that takes us on to just summarising things really, and the privilege that we hold. So I know lots of social workers will say things like, oh, this isn't why I came into the job, when they're sitting at a computer typing stuff up. But actually, it has to be why you come into the job, because what you're doing in record keeping is you are holding that person's story. And it's a great privilege to be doing that recording. And many of you, if you come to lots of the webinars, will know our great friend Yusuf McCormack. And this photograph here is of Yusuf's case file. 18 years in care, and that is what he was given. He says 12 millimeters represents 18 years of my life, and it's not enough. And so Yusuf was also a foster carer, and Yusuf always said, I take great pride in what I write about the children who I care for, and I see it as a great privilege as being a foster carer. And I think that's the thing. It's, I hear so many social workers being really negative about recording as, oh, it's not part of the job, it's the part I don't like, but actually it's a key part of the job. It's a part of the job that is a great privilege. So we would invite you to think about record keeping and use that privilege to be the difference. Mary talked earlier about a golden thread and what people might repeat. And although we did all meet last week just to check all of our sound worked and everything, it was really technical. It wasn't everybody knowing what everyone else was going to say. So the golden thread has come out through the evening. But what we did do as a group was put this together, spelling out, recording some of the key messages that we wanted to bring, that I think sit through most of the presentations. Remember the why as well as the what and the how. Why am I doing this? Why am I writing this record? Emotions, as Ian showed, think feelings, think about how people will feel if they read what you've written about them. Clarity comes when you avoid jargon. I think Alex saying about ICPC, I think that was very helpful. Opinion has to be separated from fact. That's very important. Respect and representation are core. Getting the person's voice, representing what the person says, are core in what we do as social workers all of the time. And therefore, that should be core in our record keeping. Decisions should be clearly identified, and you should be able to recognize why have those decisions been made, where have they come from. Impact, lots of people tonight have talked about the impact of what we're gathering. It's a key part of the analysis is to think about impact. Names are important. I mean, if you can't take that from what Ian said, what everybody else said too. But the other reason that names are important, you know, is that if you've misspelt somebody's name, there could be two lots of records being kept about the same person with a different spelt name. And that's happened to me a great deal as a mental health social worker in the past. I would uncover that actually there was a whole other file here about somebody, but the name was just spelt differently. So names are important, get them right. Grammar matters. We've said that, you know, spelling and grammar matters. In terms of, finally, the final hints and tips, spelling out the word reports, read it before you send it. I think that was one of Mary's key points, but it is really important. Just read what you've written before you send it. Educate yourself on the requirements. What's needed in this report? You know, what should I be including in this report? Think about the 4 Ps. I think Farrah starting us off with those 4 Ps was fabulous. Think about the purpose, point, prediction, and plan. I think that's a really good way of just thinking, have I covered it all in this record? Think about outcomes. Recognize the privilege that you have of recording people's lives. You are the storyteller of people's lives, and those records are really vital, and it's a great privilege. Think about your audience. And strengths matter. You know, we've said throughout, I think Alex concluded there talking about a strengths base, but we've talked about strengths and exceptions throughout tonight and how important those things are. So it really just remains for me to say thank you so much to our guests for giving up their time and putting things together, for top tips for recording. I'm sure that in our next season we're going to be following up and picking out key parts of this, and this is just the beginning really, I think, of some overall ideas and hints and tips around recording. I know lots of you like to know what's coming up and to have the link to join put into the chat. So next week we will be doing a session on imposter syndrome, and that's based on team members' personal experiences. So it's the Student Connect team that are delivering that together next week. Then we're looking at co-production at our kitchen table, and then we're back to the basics, building a body of theory and the theory that you use in your practice. So thank you ever so much to everybody for attending tonight. I know it's a slightly longer webinar than normal, but we've had 6 fabulous guests and actually who've stuck to time really quite well. It's really tricky to get through as much as we've got through, but I think thank you so much to our guests. I can't see what's going on in the chat when I'm doing screen sharing, but I'm going to read the chat later because I'm sure there's been lots of interesting things, and I have seen lots of questions popping up, but lots of people answering the questions as they've come. Don't forget that Kultuma and Di will put together an email and send you on any resources that our guests have talked about, and that will go into the email address that you registered with. So check your spam if you don't get it. It usually goes at the weekend. So thank you ever so much to everybody, and good night.